No bomb, no bullet, just a whisper that spread faster than any fire. During World War II, a terrifying story convinced thousands to choose death over surrender. But where did this deadly myth come from, and how did it become one of the war's most powerful hidden weapons? March 1942, Solomon Islands. In a dim, sweltering office tucked behind a warehouse in Melbourne, Lieutenant Raymond Fisher leaned over his desk, eyes locked on a single sheet of crumpled paper. The leaflet had been intercepted 2 days earlier, drifting down from the clouds over a Japanese-held island in the Pacific. At first glance, it looked like the usual wartime pamphlet: crude drawings, bold letters, promises of victory. But the words, though mostly incomprehensible to Fisher's limited grasp of Japanese, carried something darker. The illustrations told the rest of the story clearly enough. They showed American soldiers devouring human flesh. They showed Allied troops desecrating the dead. And in blocky, furious script, the leaflet warned Japanese soldiers that capture meant dishonor beyond imagination. Fisher's hands tightened around the paper. He had been trained to analyze enemy psychological operations, to separate desperation from strategy. Yet something about this felt different. It wasn't bluster, it was poison. The official response from senior command came quickly and without much thought. "Ignore it," they said. "It's nonsense, a desperate attempt to scare their own troops." On the surface, they were right. Both sides had launched leaflets into enemy skies since the war began. Promises, threats, insults, all the usual psychological theater. But this wasn't about promises or insults. This was about fear, deep, primal fear. Days later, the first interrogations confirmed Fisher's unease. Captured Japanese soldiers, young, exhausted, trembling, spoke of the Americans not as enemies, but as monsters. They refused water. They recoiled from medical care. One soldier, shaking uncontrollably, insisted that Allied troops collected body parts as trophies. Another swore that anyone taken alive would be fed to the troops as rations. At first, these testimonies were dismissed as wartime hysteria. But as the days passed and more prisoners were questioned, a pattern emerged. These were not isolated delusions. They were beliefs, widespread, unshakable. Fisher began digging deeper. He studied every intercepted leaflet, every intercepted broadcast transcript. The messaging wasn't random. Each claim seemed engineered to strike a precise nerve. The sanctity of the body, the fate of the dead, the terror of dishonor. He knew enough of Japanese culture to understand how deeply those fears ran. And he knew this was no ordinary campaign of lies. Someone in Tokyo understood psychology, not as science, but as a weapon. Reports from the front painted an increasingly puzzling picture. Japanese units cut off from supplies refused to surrender, even when starving. Patrols found lifeless soldiers still clutching their rifles, bodies positioned for a fight that would never come. Prisoners were rare. Those who survived capture often spoke of choosing death over what they believed awaited them in Allied hands. To Fisher, the implications were staggering. The propaganda wasn't just shaping opinions, it was shaping decisions. It was changing the way the war itself was fought. By early spring, fragments of this strange narrative surfaced far beyond the battlefield. Island villagers whispered tales of Americans who consumed the bodies of the fallen. Civilians evacuated their homes ahead of Allied landings, not to avoid combat, but to escape rumored atrocities. It was as if a shadow war had begun. One fought not with bullets or bombs, but with nightmares and rumors. The stakes became brutally clear during an operation near Tulagi. Leaflets written in flawless Japanese floated from the skies, promising safety and food to anyone who surrendered. None did. Dozens were found days later, lifeless, some still holding the American leaflets in their hands. Fisher read the reports in silence. It was no longer a matter of mere misinformation. It was costing lives. Every intercepted message deepened the mystery. The tone was too calculated, the claims too targeted. And then there was the scale. By mid-1942, thousands of leaflets were circulating. Shortwave broadcasts carried the same monstrous accusations across the Pacific. Even prisoners who had never seen the leaflets repeated the same horrifying details. Someone had built a machine dedicated to one purpose: to make the enemy seem inhuman. Fisher's suspicions turned to dread. These weren't the lies of a desperate nation trying to boost morale. They were part of a deliberate strategy, one that struck at the heart of Japanese beliefs about death, honor, and the afterlife. To dishonor a body was to dishonor an entire lineage, and to become the victim of such desecration was a fate worse than defeat. Late one evening, as the rain hammered against the tin roof of his office, Fisher pinned a dozen intercepted leaflets to the wall. He stepped back and studied them. There was a pattern hidden in the chaos: repeating symbols, recurring phrases, carefully placed accusations. Someone had crafted them with the precision of a surgeon. He felt a chill run through him. This was more than wartime propaganda. This was psychological warfare on a scale no one in Washington had anticipated. The next morning, Fisher sent a classified report up the chain of command. It was brief but urgent. The enemy strategy, he wrote, was no longer confined to battlefields or supply lines. It was waging war against perception itself, and if left unchecked, it could determine the outcome of the conflict. The warning, like many others in those early months, was quietly filed away. But Fisher couldn't let it go. He had seen enough to know the truth, that somewhere in Tokyo, someone understood the human mind well enough to weaponize its deepest fears, and that the most dangerous enemy was not the soldier aiming a rifle across the jungle. It was the unseen hand writing the story that soldier believed. The leaflets were just the beginning, the first whisper of a storm that would soon sweep across the Pacific, reshaping not just the course of the war, but the nature of warfare itself. And Raymond Fisher knew, with a certainty that kept him awake at night, that America was fighting an enemy it didn't yet understand. Long before the Pacific skies filled with leaflets and the jungles echoed with surrender warnings, the seeds of Japan's most insidious weapon were planted in quiet government offices in Tokyo. Years before the attack on Pearl Harbor, while the world still clung to uneasy peace, the Imperial Information Bureau was already preparing for a different kind of war, one that would never be fought with guns or ships, but with stories. In the early 1930s, Japan's military leadership recognized a simple truth. They could not match American industrial might or technological scale, but they believed they could win where machines could not: in the human mind. The Bureau was born from that belief, a centralized system designed to control narratives, shape beliefs, and weaponize perception. By 1937, it had become one of the most sophisticated propaganda networks on Earth, linking newspapers, radio stations, and cultural organizations into a single coordinated machine. From Tokyo, messages flowed outward across the empire. Speeches glorifying sacrifice, newsreels portraying Japanese destiny, pamphlets describing Western nations as corrupt and soulless. Most of it was routine wartime messaging, carefully crafted to bind a nation under the flag. But within the Bureau, a more specialized unit was being built, one dedicated not to lifting Japanese morale, but to crushing the enemies. At the heart of this unit was a man named Shigeru Kawano. Kawano was not a soldier by trade. He was a psychologist, a scholar of behavior, symbolism, and fear. In the late 1920s, he had studied at Columbia University in New York, where he immersed himself in Western culture. He watched American films, read American newspapers, and attended lectures on the psychology of persuasion. When he returned to Tokyo, he brought with him more than a degree. He brought an understanding of how Americans thought, and more importantly, how they could be made into monsters in the eyes of others. By 1941,
Kawano had risen to the rank of major within the Imperial Army Psychological Operations Division. His proposals were radical. Traditional propaganda, he argued, was too gentle. It appealed to pride and patriotism. It urged people to fight for their homeland. But fear, he believed, was far more powerful. Fear could stop a soldier from surrendering. Fear could make a civilian flee before a shot was fired. Fear could turn neighbors against each other. The concept was simple but devastating. Transform the enemy into a nightmare. Kawano focused on one specific vulnerability: the Japanese cultural reverence for the dead. For centuries, the treatment of the body after death had been deeply sacred. Families held elaborate ceremonies. Warriors believed their spirits would join their ancestors in honor if their bodies remained whole and respected. To defile a corpse was to defile the spirit itself. Kawano realized that if Allied soldiers could be portrayed as violators of this sacred trust, then the mere thought of capture would become unbearable. His team scoured reports, diaries, and photographs from the battlefields of Europe and China. Wherever they found evidence of soldiers looting or mishandling bodies, even isolated, unofficial incidents, they seized upon them. In Kawano's hands, these scattered stories became proof of a systematic policy. Leaflets claimed that Allied soldiers collected body parts as trophies. Broadcasts warned that the bodies of the fallen were used for grotesque experiments. Newspaper stories described Western soldiers as desecrators of graves and destroyers of ancestral remains. And for the Japanese soldier in the field, hungry, exhausted, and isolated, these stories were more than believable. They were terrifying. The campaign didn't stop with the troops. Kawano's operation expanded to reach Pacific Island populations, portraying the Americans as devourers of the dead and enslavers of the living. Radio broadcasts in local languages carried the message. Village elders were told that anyone aiding Allied troops would be fed to them. On some islands, Japanese officers staged false scenes, mutilated bodies left with forged Allied insignia to prove the propaganda true. The scale of the operation was staggering. Millions of leaflets were printed, thousands of hours of radio broadcasts were transmitted, and because the narratives exploited deep-rooted cultural fears rather than surface-level emotions, they spread rapidly, whispered from soldier to soldier, from villager to villager, until they became indistinguishable from truth. Yet, in early 1942, none of this was known to the Americans. In his Melbourne office, Lieutenant Raymond Fisher stared at the growing pile of intercepted leaflets. Weeks had passed since the first disturbing discovery. Now they came in bundles, each new batch more elaborate, more deliberate. He had pinned them to the walls of his office, charting patterns with red string and pencil notes. At first, he had looked for military intelligence, troop movements, supply hints, coded messages. But gradually, his focus shifted. He realized the leaflets weren't trying to reveal anything. They were trying to infect something: belief. Fisher's reports grew more urgent. He traced common phrases that hinted at shared authorship. He noted how accusations often referenced real places and events, lending credibility to the lies. He observed that even among captured prisoners, the details remained consistent, a sign that they were not improvising, but repeating indoctrinated narratives. Still, his warnings were often sidelined. Commanders wanted maps, numbers, and orders. Psychological warfare was considered a secondary front, abstract, intangible, and far removed from the logistics of battle. But Fisher saw the cost mounting. Each time a Japanese patrol fought to the last man rather than surrender, each time a starving unit refused Allied rations, the evidence grew clearer. The Americans weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting a belief system carefully constructed to outlast reason. And behind that belief system, Fisher was certain there was a mind, someone who understood both American and Japanese psychology intimately, someone who knew which ancient fears to awaken and which cultural lines to cross. Somewhere in Tokyo, the architect of that fear was watching his work take hold. And if the Americans didn't learn to fight back in this new war of the mind, Fisher feared the Pacific campaign would be lost long before the final battle was fought. The enemy was no longer just on the beaches and in the jungles. He was in the thoughts of every soldier who would rather die than surrender, and in every heart that now believed the Americans were something less than human. By the summer of 1942, the Pacific War had entered a brutal new phase. The Allies were no longer merely reacting to Japan's expansion. They were striking back. And nowhere was this shift more critical than on a small, jungle-cloaked island whose name few Americans had heard before the war, Guadalcanal. The campaign there was supposed to be straightforward: secure an airfield, push back Japanese forces, and establish a foothold for the long island-hopping campaign ahead. But from the first encounters, American commanders sensed something was wrong. The resistance they met was beyond determined. It was fanatical. At first, they attributed it to discipline or blind loyalty. Yet as the weeks dragged on, strange patterns emerged. Japanese soldiers refused to surrender, even when surrounded. Wounded men crawled into the jungle to hide rather than accept medical help. Entire units vanished, choosing to disappear into the wilderness instead of falling into Allied hands. The behavior was baffling until intelligence officers began piecing together the hidden war beneath the surface. Reports from interrogations, captured diaries, and recovered documents all pointed to the same chilling conclusion. The cannibal narrative had taken root. One diary found in a collapsed foxhole near the Matacor River contained a final trembling entry. "They offer us water. They say they will heal us. But I know the truth. The Americans will not feed us. They will eat us. Better to become part of the earth than their food." This was no isolated delusion. Across the island, Japanese soldiers echoed the same horrifying belief. To them, surrender was not merely dishonor, it was annihilation. The psychological consequences were devastating. Units cut off from supplies refused food dropped by Allied planes, believing it poisoned. Prisoners attempted to harm themselves rather than remain in captivity. And when American forces advanced on fortified positions, defenders often fought to the last breath, not because they thought they could win, but because they believed capture was worse than defeat. The campaign at Guadalcanal became a brutal lesson in how deeply propaganda could shape a battlefield. The enemy's fear was so intense it often defied reason. Even when leaflets promised safety, even when loudspeakers broadcast messages in Japanese assuring humane treatment, the soldiers refused to believe them. The Allies soon realized that this was not an isolated phenomenon. In New Guinea, captured documents revealed orders instructing soldiers never to surrender under any circumstances, for capture means desecration. At Tarawa, Marines found small wooden amulets buried in trenches, each etched with prayers against defilement, proof of how deeply the propaganda had seeped into spiritual life. For the Americans, the psychological toll was profound. They had expected a conventional enemy, one who, when outmatched, would surrender, regroup, and fight another day. Instead, they found opponents who viewed them as something less than human. Medics reported soldiers recoiling in terror at their approach. Surrendering troops often trembled uncontrollably, convinced they were moments away from unspeakable fate. It was in this climate of confusion and disbelief that a young Marine Corps translator named Paul Nakamura became an unlikely key figure. Nakamura, a second-generation Japanese-American, had grown up speaking both languages. Assigned to the Pacific Theater as a linguist, his task was simple on paper: intercept enemy messages, translate captured documents, and question prisoners. But what he uncovered shocked even seasoned intelligence officers.
As Nakamura sifted through piles of intercepted leaflets and prisoner testimonies, the full scope of the cannibal narrative emerged. It wasn't just about portraying Americans as monsters. It was a carefully constructed belief system, layered with cultural symbols and reinforced by selective evidence. Soldiers were told that Americans carried ritual knives to dismember captives. They were shown staged photographs of altered bodies, their origins impossible to verify, but terrifyingly effective. Some had even been taught that Allied soldiers consumed enemy flesh to absorb their spirit, a grotesque distortion of Japanese folklore itself. For Nakamura, the most disturbing realization was that many of these lies contained fragments of truth. Stories of looting or misconduct from earlier wars, rare and isolated though they were, had been twisted into something larger. Kawano and his team had built their empire of fear not entirely from fiction, but from carefully weaponized fragments of reality. And as the months passed, that empire only grew. The Battle of Bunagona in late 1942 saw entire Japanese units refuse evacuation, choosing to perish in their fortifications rather than face capture. In one recorded incident, a group of wounded soldiers, offered medical care and safety, instead destroyed their own provisions and crawled into the jungle, leaving notes that they refused to be meat for barbarians. For American forces, these moments were as heartbreaking as they were bewildering. The enemy's humanity, their youth, their desperation, their fear, was laid bare, even as they fought to the last. And each encounter drove home a sobering truth. Victory would not come from superior firepower alone. It would require dismantling an idea. The psychological contrast was stark. Japanese soldiers, raised to expect honorable combat and captured glory, now believed they were facing subhuman predators. American troops, trained for conventional warfare, found themselves fighting an enemy who would rather die than accept compassion. Each side saw a distorted reflection of the other, one born not of reality, but of the stories they had been told. Historical evidence from the time is haunting. Among the most revealing documents were diaries from soldiers on Saipan, many written in their final hours. One, later used as evidence in post-war studies, described a unit's decision to end their lives rather than risk capture. We have seen what they do. They do not bury our dead. They desecrate them. They will desecrate us too. It is better to leave no body for them to find. The most tragic proof of the propaganda's power came from isolated incidents where soldiers who did surrender were treated with care and could not comprehend it. Nakamura recorded testimony from one such prisoner who, after receiving medical attention, wept uncontrollably and asked why he had not been harmed. His belief had been absolute. Its shattering left him broken. By early 1943, American intelligence finally grasped the scale of the psychological war they were facing. This was no longer a matter of morale. It was a fight for the enemy's perception of reality itself. And as Raymond Fisher read through Nakamura's translations and field reports, a grim realization took hold. The propaganda was not just surviving, it was thriving. It had taken root in the minds of thousands. And once a lie becomes a belief, dislodging it is harder than any beach assault or jungle advance. It was clear now that the war for territory and the war for truth were one and the same, and the second might prove the harder battle to win. By late 1943, the cannibal narrative had evolved beyond the trenches and jungle fortifications. It no longer belonged only to soldiers crouched in foxholes or huddled in caves. It had escaped the battlefield entirely and was now shaping the thoughts, fears, and choices of people who had never even seen an American soldier. Across the vast Pacific, from the dense forests of Papua New Guinea to the scattered villages of Micronesia, a shadow was spreading.
one built not from occupation forces or marching armies, but from stories whispered in the dark. The Imperial Information Bureau had realized early that the war would not be won solely by bullets and ships. Control the local populations, and you control the ground beneath your enemy's boots. And so, their psychological campaign widened its reach. Japanese occupation authorities arrived in remote island settlements carrying more than rifles. They brought radios, leaflets, and carefully crafted tales. On one island in the Bismarck archipelago, Japanese soldiers gathered village elders beneath the trees and spoke of the approaching Americans. They were not liberators, the officers warned. They were devourers, men who carved flesh from the bodies of the living and consumed the dead. The villagers listened in silence, many too frightened to question what they heard. And when the first American patrols finally landed on the beaches weeks later, the locals fled into the jungles, leaving behind food, tools, and empty huts.
In the Philippines, Japanese-controlled radio stations broadcast urgent messages in Tagalog and Cebuano. "The Americans will come as saviors," one voice warned, "but they will leave as predators." In Papua New Guinea, local leaders were bribed or threatened into repeating the same stories during tribal gatherings. And on some islands, the occupiers went further still. They staged false evidence, displaying unidentified remains and blaming them on Allied troops. A grotesque theater designed to transform myth into proof. The impact was immediate and devastating. Where American forces had expected cooperation, they found fear. Where they had hoped for intelligence on Japanese troop movements, they were met with silence or hostility. Patrols searching for friendly villages often returned empty-handed, unable to make contact with populations that had simply vanished into the wilderness. One of the first to recognize the scale of the problem was Captain Louise Chen, a Chinese-American intelligence officer assigned to Allied field operations in the Southwest Pacific. Chen had grown up navigating two worlds, fluent in English and Mandarin, familiar with both Western and Asian cultural traditions. It made her uniquely suited to the task of countering Japanese influence. Her mission was unlike anything the U.S. military had prepared for. Chen was not tracking enemy units or decoding signals. She was tracking rumors, mapping the spread of lies and trying to stop them before they hardened into belief. It was painstaking work. In one village on Bougainville, she and her team distributed illustrated pamphlets showing photographs of Japanese prisoners being treated in field hospitals. In another, they worked with Christian missionaries to deliver sermons about American humanitarian efforts. Every effort mattered, but every success was fragile. The Japanese were always a step ahead. Whenever Chen's team managed to convince a community that the rumors were false, occupation officers would return with new stories, more elaborate than the last. They claimed the photographs were staged. They accused the missionaries of being spies. And in the most chilling tactic of all, they sometimes executed villagers in secret and blamed the killings on American raiders. The evidence was undeniable. The story deepened, the fear spread. For Allied planners, the consequences of this psychological war were enormous. Civilians who might have provided food or shelter instead sabotaged supply caches or led patrols into ambushes. Entire villages that could have been vital intelligence sources refused to speak to American scouts. In some regions, Japanese control of the narrative was so complete that locals guided lost American airmen directly into enemy hands, believing they were delivering monsters to justice. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming fear, there were moments of defiance. In a remote village along the north coast of New Guinea, an elderly chieftain named Tabo refused to repeat the Japanese lies. He had seen their cruelty firsthand, the forced labor, the burned homes, the disappearances. When occupation officers arrived to spread their warnings about flesh-eating Americans, Tabo told his people to trust their own eyes, not the stories of strangers. Months later, when U.S. forces landed nearby, Tabo's village became a crucial base of operations, providing food, shelter, and guides.
Across the Pacific, similar acts of quiet courage occurred. Small, scattered sparks of resistance against the tide of propaganda. Australian coast watchers, operating deep behind enemy lines, helped coordinate leaflet drops that countered Japanese messaging. Allied intelligence units began smuggling portable radios into occupied territories, broadcasting messages that highlighted American humanitarian aid and the humane treatment of prisoners. These efforts didn't erase the fear entirely, but they planted doubt. And sometimes, doubt was enough. Yet the most disturbing revelation of all came in late 1943, when Chen intercepted a Japanese field report detailing their progress. The document boasted that local resistance to American landings had increased by nearly 40% in regions where the cannibal narrative had been actively spread. Villages once expected to rise against the occupiers now hesitated, too terrified of the liberators to act. It was a sobering reminder that this war was about more than ships, tanks, and divisions. It was about perception. It was about belief. And it was about fear so deep it could turn potential allies into enemies without a single shot being fired. For Lieutenant Raymond Fisher back in Melbourne, the reports from Chen and others painted a grim picture. The propaganda he had first seen scrawled across crude leaflets was no longer confined to battlefields. It had become a weapon wielded against entire populations, a psychological siege designed to isolate the Allies, deny them local support, and stretch the war far beyond the reach of conventional strategy. The cannibal narrative was no longer just a story. It was now part of the landscape of war. An invisible fortress that could repel armies as effectively as concrete and steel. And as the Allied advance pushed closer to Japan's inner defensive ring, it became clear that this invisible war would soon reach a new level of intensity, one that Washington could no longer afford to ignore.
By mid-1943, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Reports from every corner of the Pacific told the same story. Japanese troops refusing to surrender, civilians vanishing into jungles, entire villages sabotaging Allied plans before the first shot was fired. The cannibal narrative was no longer a bizarre curiosity found in intercepted leaflets. It was a weapon, one powerful enough to shape battlefields and cost lives. In Washington, the gravity of the situation finally broke through. Senior officials gathered inside the gray, windowless rooms of the War Department to discuss a problem unlike any they had faced before. The enemy's lies were not simply damaging morale, they were rewriting reality. And if America didn't fight back, the psychological war could drag the conflict into a deeper, darker chapter. The result was a quiet but significant decision: the creation of a specialized psychological warfare unit within the Office of War Information. Its mission was simple in theory but daunting in practice: counter the Japanese campaign and prove to the world, and especially to the Japanese people, that America was not the monster they had been taught to fear. The new unit brought together an unusual mix of people: linguists, anthropologists, propagandists, and intelligence officers. Among them was Dr. Helen Yamamoto, a civilian advisor and cultural psychologist. Born in California to Japanese immigrant parents, she had spent years studying the intricate web of beliefs that shaped Japanese society. She understood the depth of ancestral reverence, the shame associated with dishonor, and the power of myth. Her task was to help craft a counter-narrative that could pierce the layers of fear sown by Major Shigeru Kawano's machine. But from the very start, Yamamoto and her team faced an impossible question. How do you prove you're not a monster to someone who refuses to believe you exist as anything else? Traditional propaganda methods were useless. Leaflets urging surrender were ignored.
Radio broadcasts promising humane treatment went unheard. Even first-hand testimonies from captured Japanese soldiers were dismissed as fabrications. The fear had hardened into belief, and belief, once planted, was nearly unbreakable.
The unit tried a range of strategies. One was the Safe Conduct Pass. Leaflets dropped over enemy positions guaranteeing fair treatment and proper burial to anyone who surrendered. Each pass was carefully worded, even including diagrams of how prisoners would be processed and cared for. But results were limited. The leaflets often became evidence for the very lies they were meant to refute. Why, one captured soldier asked, would they need to promise safety if they were not planning harm? Another approach involved the voices of those who had already experienced American captivity. Japanese prisoners who had surrendered and received medical care were asked, sometimes persuaded, to record radio messages describing their treatment. The broadcasts aired across occupied territories, telling listeners that they had been fed, clothed, and respected. Yet even this was fraught with ethical dilemmas. Some in Washington questioned whether it was right to use prisoners as tools of propaganda. Others argued that the stakes were too high to worry about moral gray areas. The unit also experimented with visual evidence. Photographs were taken of Japanese prisoners working on farms, reading newspapers, and writing letters home. These images were distributed across the Pacific in leaflet form. A few even reached Japanese newspapers through neutral channels, though they were quickly dismissed as staged. Every effort was a battle against deeply rooted fear, and every success, however small, felt like a victory. On one island in the Marshalls, a handful of Japanese soldiers surrendered after hearing the voice of a former comrade on a broadcast. In another case, villagers in Papua New Guinea approached an American patrol after being shown photographs of Japanese prisoners receiving respectful burials. These were minor wins, but they signaled that the wall of fear, though towering, was not impenetrable. Inside the War Department, debate grew intense. Some leaders argued for a more aggressive strategy, publicizing the absurdity of the accusations and openly mocking them. Others feared that even acknowledging the lies would legitimize them and give them wider reach. In the end, Washington chose a middle path: continue the slow, steady work of building credibility through action rather than rhetoric. On the ground, soldiers were told to document every instance of humane treatment. Field photographers captured medics tending to Japanese wounded. Clerks recorded the respectful handling of enemy dead. These records were intended not only for wartime propaganda, but also for the historical record, proof that America had fought honorably, even against an enemy that refused to believe it. Dr. Yamamoto pushed for deeper cultural strategies. She argued that the United States needed to speak not only to the Japanese soldier, but to the cultural framework that shaped his fear. Messages began to emphasize respect for ancestors and the sanctity of burial. Leaflets included passages referencing Shinto beliefs, explaining that captured soldiers would receive care that honored their spirit and family. Slowly, these more nuanced messages found their way into the field. And still, the results were painfully uneven. American forces continued to encounter units that fought to the last, convinced they were resisting monsters. Villagers still fled before landing parties. Even when surrender did occur, prisoners often remained convinced that their captors' kindness was a trick, a temporary facade before the inevitable horror. By the end of 1943, the psychological warfare unit had learned a hard lesson. Winning this war would require more than clever messaging. It demanded time, patience, and relentless consistency. It required actions that spoke louder than words, a pattern of behavior so clear and so humane that it could begin to erode even the most deeply ingrained fears. For soldiers in the field, that realization came at a heavy cost. Men watched their enemies choose death over safety again and again. They reached out to save lives only to have their hands rejected. The frustration was overwhelming, yet it also taught them something crucial: that this war was not only about destroying Japan's armies, but about dismantling the myths that fueled them. Raymond Fisher saw that shift firsthand in the reports crossing his desk in Melbourne. Each dispatch told a story not of battles won or lost, but of perceptions challenged and beliefs slowly beginning to bend. It was clear now that the outcome of the Pacific War would not be decided solely by who controlled the seas or skies. It would hinge on who controlled the truth. The United States was beginning to understand that victory was not just a military objective, it was a psychological necessity. And as the next phase of the war approached, the battle for the mind would become as critical as any fought on the beaches or in the jungles.
Summer 1944, Saipan. For months, American planners had known that the battle for this island would be decisive. Saipan was not just another patch of territory in the Pacific. It was a strategic stepping stone, a launch point for bombing raids against the Japanese mainland, and a critical link in the chain tightening around Tokyo's empire. But no amount of military preparation could have prepared the Allies for what they were about to face there. The fighting began on June 15. American forces stormed the beaches under heavy fire, pushing inland yard by yard against entrenched Japanese defenders. It was a brutal, grinding campaign, but not unexpected. What came next, however, was. As the island's defenses crumbled, thousands of Japanese civilians, farmers, merchants, mothers carrying infants on their backs, found themselves caught between advancing American troops and retreating Japanese forces. Leaflets promising safety and medical care rained from the skies. Loudspeakers blared messages urging surrender. Translators shouted assurances through megaphones. Yet the civilians did not come forward. They fled deeper inland, vanishing into caves, ravines, and abandoned villages. American soldiers, puzzled but cautious, advanced carefully. It soon became clear that something far more dangerous than military resistance was unfolding. The propaganda that had begun as whispers in leaflets and rumors in occupied villages had reached its most destructive form. Japanese officers on Saipan had spent weeks drilling the cannibal narrative into the civilian population. Surrender, they warned, would mean a fate worse than death. Women would be taken and consumed. Children would be butchered. Ancestors would be dishonored. The Americans were not men, they were predators. And the civilians believed them. By late June, the situation had grown desperate. Families were seen wandering the cliffs along Saipan's northern coast, some clutching small bundles of belongings, others carrying little more than heirloom photographs. When American patrols approached, they scattered in terror. Attempts to communicate were met with screams and silence. It was as if the very sight of the Allied uniform confirmed their worst fears. At Marpy Point, the tragedy reached its breaking point. The cliffs there rise hundreds of feet above the Pacific, their jagged edges overlooking the sea. As American units closed in, hundreds of civilians gathered at the edge. Some prayed, others sang, and then, one by one, they stepped forward and vanished into the waves below. Entire families, fathers, mothers, children, chose death rather than the imagined horror of capture. American troops watched helplessly. They shouted for the civilians to stop. They held up food and water. Some soldiers risked their own safety, scrambling across the rocks to pull people back from the edge. But nothing could break the grip of the lies they had been told. The fear was too deep, the story too strong. Among those on the front lines was Marine Sergeant Robert Tanaka, a Japanese-American interpreter. He had been brought in to speak directly to the civilians, to plead with them in their own language. Day after day, Tanaka walked toward the cliffs with his hands raised, shouting that they would not be harmed, that they would be treated with dignity. On one desperate afternoon, he waded waist-deep into the surf, begging families not to leap. Some paused. Most did not. The losses were staggering. Historians still debate the exact number, but estimates suggest that thousands of civilians perished in those final weeks on Saipan, not from battle, but from belief. They had been convinced that surrender meant annihilation, and so they chose their own end instead. For the American soldiers who witnessed it, the psychological toll was immense. They had come to expecting to fight an enemy army. They found themselves trying to save terrified civilians from an invisible enemy, one that lived not in trenches or bunkers, but in their minds. Men who had faced artillery and machine guns with steady resolve now broke down in tears at the sight of children disappearing into the sea.
The tragedy at Marpy Point shattered any illusions Washington had left about the nature of this war. Propaganda was no longer just shaping tactics or prolonging battles, it was causing mass civilian death on a scale no one had anticipated, and it was doing so without a single bullet being fired. Captured diaries and testimonies collected after the battle revealed the depth of the deception. One young woman wrote that she had been told Americans would feed her children to their beasts. Another recorded a speech from a local official warning that to fall into enemy hands is to lose one's soul. Even after the battle ended, survivors continued to express disbelief that they were being given food and medical care. The tragedy also forced a painful reckoning within the ranks of the U.S. military. Could they have done more? Should they have anticipated this outcome? The answers were elusive, but one lesson was undeniable. Psychological warfare was no longer a side campaign. It was the war. In the aftermath of Saipan, new directives poured out of Washington. Psychological operations would no longer be handled as an auxiliary function. They would be central to every major campaign from that point forward. Counter-propaganda would not just accompany invasions, it would lead them. Anthropologists, linguists, and cultural experts were given prominent roles in operational planning, and soldiers on the front lines received new training on how to engage with civilians terrified by enemy lies.
The events on Saipan also changed the hearts of those who fought there. For many American troops, the battle marked the first time they understood the true power of belief and the terrible consequences of letting a lie go unchallenged. They had come to the island to defeat an army. They left it haunted by the knowledge that words had destroyed more lives than weapons ever could. When the last shots were fired and the last pockets of resistance silenced, Saipan was declared secure, but the victory felt hollow. The island was scarred by silence, empty homes, abandoned fields, and the echo of grief that clung to every cliffside. For Lieutenant Raymond Fisher, the reports that crossed his desk in the weeks that followed were difficult to read. They spoke not only of military success, but of a profound failure. A failure to understand the depth of the psychological battlefield until it was too late. Saipan was proof that propaganda could do more than sustain an army. It could convince an entire population to destroy itself. And if the Allies wanted to avoid seeing that tragedy repeated on Okinawa, on Iwo Jima, or on the Japanese mainland itself, they would need to do more than win battles. They would need to win minds. The war had reached a turning point, and from this moment on, the fight for truth would be as vital as the fight for territory.
The tragedy of Saipan was more than a wake-up call. It was a turning point. For American commanders and intelligence officers, the message was now unmistakable. If they failed to understand and dismantle Japan's propaganda machine, the next stage of the war could spiral into an even greater humanitarian disaster. The stakes were no longer just strategic, they were moral. Within weeks of the battle's end, a massive intelligence effort was launched across the Pacific. Naval patrols swept captured islands not only for weapons and supplies, but for paper, documents, manuals, and handwritten notes that might reveal how Japan's psychological warfare network functioned. Air raids targeted not just ports and airfields, but printing presses and radio transmitters. And behind the front lines, teams of analysts began piecing together the enemy's psychological playbook.
One of the most significant breakthroughs came on the island of Tinian, captured shortly after Saipan. Buried beneath a collapsed warehouse near the island's main harbor, Marines discovered crates of printed leaflets and radio scripts. Hundreds of them, carefully cataloged and stamped with Tokyo's Imperial Information Bureau seal. The materials ranged from crude cartoons to sophisticated essays on Allied barbarism. Some even referenced American military units by name, showing just how closely Japan's propagandists monitored their enemy. The documents revealed what Lieutenant Raymond Fisher had long suspected. The cannibal narrative was not random. It was part of a vast, centrally coordinated campaign directed from Tokyo and executed with ruthless precision. Teams of writers, psychologists, and military officers worked side by side to craft each message, tailoring it for specific audiences: Japanese soldiers, Pacific Islanders, Allied troops, even Western journalists.
For Fisher and his colleagues, these papers were a goldmine. They showed exactly how fear was constructed and reinforced, which words were repeated most often, which cultural taboos were invoked, which images triggered the strongest emotional responses. And they confirmed that Major Shigeru Kawano, the architect of the propaganda network, had turned psychological warfare into a science. Yet, perhaps the most surprising discovery wasn't what was found in the leaflets themselves, but in a set of handwritten notes tucked into a binder marked Special Studies. These notes hinted that elements of Japan's psychological campaign might not have originated in Tokyo at all. Phrases in German appeared alongside Japanese text. References to European information techniques were scattered throughout. It suggested that Japanese propagandists had been exchanging ideas and possibly collaborating with their German counterparts. If true, the psychological war in the Pacific was part of something much larger than anyone had realized. While analysts in Washington pored over the documents, field intelligence units began pursuing a different, more human solution. They turned their attention to the one source of information the Japanese propaganda machine could not manipulate: those who had once believed its lies, but no longer did. In makeshift prison camps across the Pacific, captured Japanese soldiers, many still struggling to reconcile what they'd been taught with what they were experiencing, became an unexpected weapon against Tokyo's narrative. Some refused to speak. Others, shaken by the stark difference between propaganda and reality, agreed to help. One such soldier, a former sergeant from the 17th Infantry, volunteered to record a radio message describing his surrender and subsequent treatment. He spoke of medical care, warm meals, and respect from American guards. Broadcast into Japanese-held territory, his words reached thousands. More importantly, they carried an authenticity that no Allied propaganda could replicate. It was not a foreign voice denying monstrous accusations. It was one of their own, quietly telling the truth. Lieutenant Grace Morrison, a rising figure in Navy intelligence, was among those who recognized the potential of these first-hand accounts. Morrison, a meticulous analyst with a background in communication psychology, helped design a new initiative, the Truth Campaign. The goal was not to counter every lie with a rebuttal, an impossible task, but to present overwhelming, undeniable evidence of American humanity. The truth leaflets that followed were unlike anything previously used in the Pacific. Instead of empty promises or patriotic slogans, they featured photographs of Japanese prisoners writing letters, tending gardens, and participating in religious ceremonies. Others showed respectful burial ceremonies for fallen enemy soldiers, complete with markers bearing their names. The images were powerful not because they shouted a message, but because they allowed the truth to speak for itself. The effort extended to civilian populations as well. Anthropologists advised on messaging that acknowledged and respected local traditions. Field operatives distributed photographs of American medical teams treating islanders.
In one notable instance, a shortwave broadcast in Micronesian dialects described how American forces had rebuilt a village's water system after liberation. It was a subtle shift in strategy, less about debunking lies and more about replacing fear with tangible evidence of goodwill.
The results, though gradual, were undeniable. On some islands, villagers who had once fled at the sight of Allied troops began approaching them cautiously, bringing food and information. Surrender rates among Japanese soldiers in certain sectors rose for the first time since the war began. Even reports from intercepted communications hinted at cracks forming in the propagandist's hold. One Japanese officer wrote despairingly that the enemy's false kindness is confusing our men. But the psychological battle was far from over. Tokyo responded to the truth campaign with renewed ferocity, broadcasting that the photographs were staged and the messages fabricated. Leaflets from Japan now accused captured soldiers of being coerced into lying. And yet, even these frantic efforts betrayed something crucial. The propaganda machine was on the defensive. Its grip on the narrative was beginning to loosen. For Fisher, Morrison, and their colleagues, these small victories carried immense significance. They proved that belief, no matter how deeply entrenched, could be changed, not by force, but by consistent truth. And they underscored a deeper lesson. Psychological warfare was not just about deception. It was also about trust. And trust, once earned, could be more powerful than any weapon. Still, one question remained unanswered. The notes hinting at foreign collaboration lingered in the minds of Allied analysts. If Germany had indeed helped shape Japan's psychological campaign, what else had they shared? And more importantly, how much of this war for the mind was yet to be uncovered? As the Allies prepared for the final bloody push toward Japan's home islands, one thing was certain. The battle over truth was far from finished. But for the first time, America was no longer reacting to lies. It was actively dismantling them. The enemy's greatest weapon was starting to falter. And with every surrender, every cautious handshake, and every whispered word of truth, the tide of the psychological war was beginning to turn. By early 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, most desperate stage. The American island-hopping campaign had pierced deep into Japan's defensive perimeter. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were in Allied hands. The skies over Tokyo trembled with the rumble of American bombers. The home islands themselves were now within reach. And yet, as the end of the war approached, the battle for truth was about to reach its most dangerous chapter. Tokyo knew that a direct confrontation with America's industrial might was unwinnable. Its military was stretched thin. Its navy, once feared, lay shattered. But the empire still held one last weapon, the one that had caused chaos from the Solomons to Saipan: fear. And in these final months, it would deploy that weapon with unprecedented intensity. The cannibal narrative, once aimed primarily at soldiers and island populations, now turned inward, toward Japan's own civilians. Leaflets distributed in cities warned that the Americans were coming not as occupiers, but as destroyers. Radio Tokyo broadcast nightly messages claiming that Allied troops would enslave entire families, raise temples, and feast on the bodies of the dead. Newspapers repeated fabricated testimonies from supposed survivors of Allied atrocities. And in schoolhouses, children were told that capture would mean humiliation worse than death. It was the same story that had haunted foxholes and jungles, now unleashed on an entire nation. And its effect was swift. As American forces prepared to invade Iwo Jima, intelligence reports painted a disturbing picture. Civilian militias arming themselves with bamboo spears, families digging trenches in their gardens, children practicing self-destruction drills. On the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, the consequences of that fear became horrifyingly clear. The Japanese garrison, already sworn to fight to the end, was now driven by something deeper than duty,
a conviction that surrender would bring annihilation. They fought from tunnels, caves, and hidden bunkers with a ferocity that stunned even battle-hardened Marines. Many refused medical care when captured. Some civilians who had been brought to the island as laborers chose to hide rather than risk discovery. The story repeated itself on Okinawa. As American troops advanced across the island, they encountered not only soldiers, but civilians who had been transformed into participants in the Empire's final act of psychological resistance. Entire villages evacuated ahead of the invasion, disappearing into forests. Families destroyed their own homes before American patrols arrived. The propaganda had painted such a vivid portrait of horror that many civilians viewed the invaders as less than human, and nothing could convince them otherwise. Yet, amid this tide of fear, signs of change began to emerge. The counter-propaganda efforts launched after Saipan were starting to make an impact. Slowly and unevenly, but unmistakably, American psychological warfare teams, now embedded with combat units, set up loudspeakers that broadcast messages from prisoners describing humane treatment in captivity. Leaflets were dropped that included photographs of families reunited after surrender. Field hospitals treated captured civilians with extraordinary care, and word of that treatment spread. One incident on Okinawa illustrated the shifting landscape of belief. Near the village of Yomitan, the group of civilians who had been hiding for days finally emerged, waving white cloths. They explained later that they had seen leaflets showing Japanese prisoners working peacefully in American-run camps. At first they had dismissed them as lies, but when they encountered a patrol that offered them food and medical care instead of violence, they realized the truth. These moments were small but significant. They show that even the most deeply embedded narratives could be broken, not by force, but by consistent, undeniable acts of humanity. Every life saved through surrender, every villager who stepped forward instead of hiding, was a victory in a war where victory was measured not in miles gained, but in minds changed. Still, the toll remained heavy. Civilian casualties on Okinawa were catastrophic, fueled in part by the very fears Tokyo had sown. Entire families took their own lives rather than risk capture. Groups of students trained to resist refused to approach American forces even when surrounded. The propaganda that had begun as a tactical tool was now shaping the very fabric of Japanese society, twisting patriotism into terror, honor into despair. Inside the Pentagon, these reports forced a sobering reassessment. The psychological cost of invading Japan itself was now clear. If fear could drive thousands of civilians to self-destruction on Okinawa, what would happen on the densely populated home islands? Estimates of potential casualties soared, not just from combat but from the psychological consequences of the lies Tokyo had spent years spreading. These questions weighed heavily on the minds of American planners. They shaped strategies, influenced decisions, and became one of the many factors that would eventually guide the course of the war's end. While the debate over how to end the conflict would involve many considerations, military, political, and scientific, the shadow of psychological warfare loomed over them all. For Lieutenant Raymond Fisher, reading the intelligence summaries from Iwo Jima and Okinawa was like watching a familiar nightmare unfold on a grand scale. The enemy's lies had grown more desperate, more elaborate, but also more brittle. They were powerful, yes, but they were beginning to crack under the pressure of reality. One intercepted broadcast from Radio Tokyo captured the shifting mood perfectly. "The enemy pretends to offer mercy," the announcer declared, "but do not be fooled. Their kindness is the mask of a beast." To Fisher, that line was telling. The propaganda no longer claimed the Americans were monsters without question. It now urged people not to believe the evidence of their own eyes, a sign that the truth was beginning to compete with the lies. By the summer of 1945, the psychological war had entered its final stage. Tokyo's propaganda machine, once seemingly invincible, was now fighting for survival. American broadcasts penetrated deeper into Japanese territory than ever before. Leaflets blanketed cities and towns. Stories of captured civilians living safely under Allied care spread quietly from village to village. The results were subtle but profound. Reports from reconnaissance teams noted increasing numbers of civilians attempting to approach American lines. Prisoner interrogations revealed confusion and doubt among Japanese troops. The myth of the monstrous enemy, once absolute, was beginning to fracture. The war was nearing its end, but the battle over perception, the conflict for the Japanese mind and soul, was still raging. And as Allied leaders prepared for the final decisions that would bring the conflict to a close, they knew that how this psychological struggle ended would shape not only the surrender, but the peace that followed.
August 1945. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Cities once ablaze with conflict now stood silent beneath the occupying flags. Across the Pacific, Allied ships ferried soldiers home, and families waited for the return of sons and husbands. But in Tokyo, within the austere rooms of government offices and abandoned ministries, another battle, quieter but no less significant, was about to begin. The collapse of the empire had exposed more than military defeat. It had laid bare the vast machinery of lies that had fueled Japan's war effort for nearly a decade. In the days following the surrender, American occupation forces swept through the capital, seizing documents, archives, and recordings. They found rooms lined floor to ceiling with files from the Imperial Information Bureau, carefully cataloged propaganda campaigns, internal reports on psychological operations, transcripts of radio broadcasts, and production records for the millions of leaflets dropped over the Pacific. It was a staggering discovery. The documents revealed the full scale of an effort that had been far larger and more sophisticated than even the most seasoned intelligence officers had suspected. There were detailed studies on cultural psychology, complete with analyses of how certain fears could be amplified. There were surveys of enemy behavior compiled from field reports, showing how belief in the cannibal narrative had influenced surrender rates. Some files even contained directives signed by high-ranking officials, instructing local commanders to stage scenes of atrocity to verify their claims. But perhaps the most chilling discovery of all were the internal memoranda acknowledging, in plain clinical language, that many civilians would rather die than risk capture if the propaganda succeeded. Those deaths were not unintended consequences. They were anticipated.
General Douglas MacArthur, now Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, faced a profound question. How should the world respond to this campaign of psychological warfare? Could words, mere words, constitute a war crime if they had driven thousands to their deaths? The legal system had little precedent. Traditional war crimes tribunals focused on physical atrocities, massacres, forced labor, inhumane treatment of prisoners. But what about the deliberate weaponization of fear? The issue quickly became one of the most debated topics in the post-war investigations. Prosecutors argued that the propaganda campaign had not simply spread lies, it had directly caused civilian casualties by encouraging suicide and resistance in hopeless situations. They presented evidence from Saipan, Okinawa, and the Philippines, showing how civilians, manipulated by the belief that Americans were monsters, had chosen death over surrender. Diaries, recovered from the dead, described their terror in heartbreaking detail. One woman wrote that she had jumped from a cliff with her children because she believed the Americans would turn them into beasts. Defenders of the propaganda officials countered that psychological operations were a recognized tool of war, one used by every nation, including the Allies. They insisted that the deaths were tragic but unintentional, a byproduct of wartime fear rather than a deliberate strategy. Some argued that the propagandists had genuinely believed they were protecting their people by preparing them for the worst. The most high-profile figure in these hearings was Major Shigeru Kawano, the man Raymond Fisher had once called the architect of fear. Captured in the final days of the war, Kawano appeared before investigators calm and composed. He did not deny his role. In fact, he described his work in meticulous detail, framing it as a patriotic duty. We knew we could not match American firepower, so we fought where we could, in the mind. It was our duty to keep our soldiers and our people from surrendering. When pressed on the civilian deaths caused by his propaganda, Kawano remained unshaken. The Americans dropped bombs on our cities. We dropped ideas. They chose their weapons. We chose ours. The tribunal's deliberations were complex and deeply divisive. In the end, only a handful of propaganda officials were charged with crimes, and most received relatively light sentences compared to those responsible for physical atrocities. Kawano himself served a brief prison term before being released. In the new post-war Japan, many former propagandists quietly reintegrated into society. Some became professors or writers. A few even found work advising Japan's new democratic government on media and communications. For the American occupation authorities, the challenge extended far beyond questions of guilt and punishment. They faced the monumental task of rebuilding trust, a trust that had been shattered by years of deliberate dehumanization. How do you convince a nation raised to believe you are a monster that you are, in fact, not? MacArthur's administration approached the problem with patience and precision. Educational reforms rewrote school curricula, stripping away wartime myths and introducing new narratives about democracy and international cooperation. Radio programs broadcast stories of American aid and reconstruction efforts. Censorship, though controversial, was used to prevent the resurgence of militarist propaganda. And slowly, piece by piece, a new story began to take root, one not of fear, but of coexistence. Testimonies from Japanese civilians collected during this period revealed the deep scars left by the propaganda war. Some admitted they still could not fully trust Americans, even after months of peaceful occupation. Others described the shame they felt upon learning that the atrocities they had feared were fabrications. A few spoke of guilt for believing lies so deeply that they had turned against their own survival. American veterans, too, wrestled with complex emotions. Many had entered the war believing they were fighting an enemy determined and ruthless, but ultimately rational. Instead, they found themselves battling phantoms, not of flesh and blood, but of belief and fear. Some never forgot the sight of civilians leaping from cliffs or soldiers refusing water in captivity. The victory they had fought for felt, at times, hollow. And yet, amid the sorrow and the moral reckoning, something remarkable began to happen. Slowly, cautiously, bridges were built. Former enemies shared meals. Children played together in bombed-out streets. Soldiers who had once stared at each other through rifle sights now exchanged photographs of their families. The scars remained, but they were no longer barriers. They were reminders.
For Raymond Fisher, now back in Washington, the post-war revelations confirmed everything he had feared in those early days in Melbourne. The propaganda war had not just shaped battles, it had shaped the very soul of the conflict. It had shown that a story once believed could be more destructive than any bomb. And it had proven that victory in war was not measured only by the territory gained, but by the humanity that survived the lies. The reckoning was incomplete. It always would be. But in the ruins of Tokyo and the silence of the Pacific, the world had learned a lesson it would not forget. The most devastating weapon of war is not forged in steel. It is forged in the human imagination.
The guns fell silent in 1945, but the echoes of the propaganda war never truly faded. They lingered in the diaries of soldiers who chose death over surrender. They haunted the families who lost loved ones to lies. They lived on in the memories of American veterans who watched terrified civilians run from the very people who had come to save them. In the decades that followed, historians and psychologists would attempt to measure the impact of Japan's psychological campaign. The numbers were staggering. Estimates suggested that tens of thousands of civilian deaths, from Saipan's cliffs to Okinawa's caves, could be traced, at least in part, to propaganda-induced fear. Thousands more Japanese soldiers refused medical treatment or resisted surrender because of the stories they had been told. Entire island communities were shaped by falsehoods designed to manipulate their deepest cultural instincts. Yet, as scholars examined the campaign's mechanics, they found something deeper than statistics. The propaganda war had revealed a fundamental truth about the human condition, that perception can be more powerful than reality, and that a carefully crafted story can defeat even the strongest army. It also transformed the way America approached the art of psychological warfare. The lessons learned in the Pacific shaped U.S. strategy for decades to come. Future military operations placed greater emphasis on understanding local culture, belief systems, and historical memory. Intelligence units were trained not only to intercept messages, but to interpret the fears and hopes embedded within them. The United States learned that propaganda was not simply about spreading messages. It was about shaping the emotional landscape in which those messages lived. Cultural understanding became a critical part of post-war military planning. In conflicts from Korea to Vietnam and beyond, American psychological operations drew heavily on the experiences of World War II, seeking to counter misinformation before it could harden into belief. The idea was simple but profound. If fear could lead people to die for a lie, then truth, carefully delivered and patiently repeated, could save lives.
The human side of this lesson was perhaps the most powerful of all. In the years after the war, Japanese-American veterans who had once served as translators and propagandists were honored for their work in breaking through enemy lies. Their stories, often overlooked in the immediate aftermath of the war, came to symbolize the importance of empathy in warfare. They had used their knowledge of language and culture not to destroy, but to build understanding, to save lives, and to replace hatred with truth. Interviews recorded decades later with veterans on both sides revealed the lingering weight of those wartime lies. Some Japanese soldiers spoke of the shame they felt when they realized the Americans had treated their wounded with care and buried their dead with respect. Others recalled the shock of seeing former enemies offering food to their children. For many, the experience forced a reevaluation of everything they had believed about the nature of their enemy and about the nature of war itself. For American veterans, the memories were no less complicated. Many carried with them the image of Saipan's cliffs and Okinawa's caves, reminders that even the most disciplined army can be powerless in the face of deeply rooted fear. Some spoke of guilt for not having done more to counter the lies. Others expressed pride in the efforts they had made to show mercy and humanity, even when none was expected in return. In the rubble of post-war Tokyo, a photograph was taken in 1947 that came to symbolize the enduring power of truth. It showed a group of American and Japanese children playing together in a park, their laughter echoing across a city still scarred by war. For many observers, it was more than a simple image of innocence. It was a testament to the idea that trust, once shattered, could be rebuilt, not through weapons or treaties, but through small acts of understanding and shared humanity. The victory America claimed in 1945 was not free of cost. It had been purchased with sacrifice, loss, and the heavy burden of a war that extended far beyond the battlefield.
The United States had won the physical war, but the psychological scars endured, for soldiers and civilians, victors and vanquished alike. The cannibal narrative and the propaganda machine that sustained it had revealed not only the darkness of human fear, but also the resilience of human hope. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the propaganda war, that the greatest weapon in any conflict is not a bomb, a bullet, or a battleship. It is the story we tell about ourselves, about our enemies, and about the world we believe we are fighting for. Lies can destroy. They can divide. They can drive people to unthinkable acts. But truth, no matter how slowly it spreads, has the power to heal. As history's pages turn, the story of this shadow war serves as a warning and a guide. Fear remains a powerful weapon, but so too does empathy. And in the end, the battle that matters most is the one fought not on the ground or in the air, but in the human heart, where hatred is born, where trust is rebuilt, and where peace, fragile but enduring, begins.